collaboration and cooperation. And, when we made those decisions in how we had to address this global virus, this pandemic, and asked, I said to people, you need to go home and stay home, and that's how you will stay safe. Once again, we weren't prepared as a community, as a city, as a province, as a country, to support the people properly who didn't have a home to go to. And so we've seen really tragic consequences in the inner city. We've lost more people to overdose. The community still is, it's a grieving and angry community for years now in our failure to properly address the overdose and the poison drug supply. We have seen really terrible rise in violence against women and not just in the inner city, but for those who don't have a safe home to go home to, we were not prepared as a society to support people well. And so we've had some really tragic consequences. And as we start to reopen now, what I've witnessed so much over the years is, we live in it's true that we live in a compassionate society, but we also have over and over again sort of treated people from the inner city as a problem, as something to be, as a group of people to be contained or to be moved or to be moved along, or rather than recognizing that we are in this community together and we need to find ways to support each other and live together. And so as we start to reopen, I see, I can see once again, some of that shifting away from how do we help to how do we kind of contain people or move people so that we can go back to doing what we used to be doing. And so that's hard, I think, for my whole team to try to. They're all working very hard to see what we can learn from this, and how do we take positive things out of this very intense work of the last few months, and move ahead. Can we move ahead differently?
As a city, we've been working on these issues for a long time. What haven't we learned, or what do we need to learn to see those changes?
Maybe fortunately or unfortunately, I feel like the COVID-19 pandemic has given us an opportunity in the inner city to prove the model of Central City Foundation, which is, we believe in being, that we must be together in this community. We must have proximity. We must do what we call at Central City radical listening. Others have defined it as sort of listening, not just to really understand, but also listening to for the moments of transformation or the opportunity for change in the conversation. And so listening to our community partners that way, and then truly trying to lift up the voices of those most affected as the ones to lead us to the change. And it doesn't mean that we believe that people from the inner city are going to do this by themselves. That's not what we mean. We mean that that's where the leadership should come from. And then we, sort of how do we support that leadership? And I'm hoping that not just the city, but the province and, all levels of government will find a way to not just consult with community, but really open up opportunities for that community leadership to show us the way to address some of these problems on a much longer term, in a way that will actually lead to change.
I saw a report recently from Vantage Point and a number of articles in various newspapers about the difficulty that not-for-profits and I assume foundations, and the prediction that a third of them will be closing their doors by the end of the year. What do you foresee has to change?
I think, in addition to watching the community come together, and, we've had this amazing. And it's not just in the inner city. We've been you and I both have been deeply involved in that conversation in this sort of part of our community. But across, Metro Vancouver, for example, organizations have been working to creatively deliver services that they're no longer able to do in traditional ways, right? And we've seen lots of organizations do that, and it's made visible, for me, what it's made visible is that question that fundraisers are always asking, right? What would the world be like if your organization wasn't there? And we've just seen what the world can be like without the community benefit sector, right? Without dance companies, without arts organizations, without neighborhood houses, without community centers, without, this, we've seen what this looks like, right? And I think we will see, as groups struggle to reopen creatively some of their programs and services, we'll continue to see huge gaps in addressing people's basic needs. Food security across our community has become so visible. I had the privilege, I would say, to serve on the advisory for the Vancouver Foundation's Community Response Fund during these last few weeks. So that was, a partnership with Van City, the City of Vancouver, and United Way. And together we have distributed almost $10 million across sort of Vancouver, Fraser Valley to community organizations. I would say that of the $8 million that went into social services and health, easily 80% had a food security aspect to them. And so that tells me that, that level of precarity in community is really dramatic. So we've seen, we've had this experiment. We've also seen, I think, a tremendous coming together from the philanthropic side of the community sector, which are foundations, philanthropists, private, public, and sort of philanthropic advisors, to try to figure out how to respond really quickly, and have responded quickly, and have responded in absolutely unique ways. So the Community Response Fund has not only distributed millions of dollars, but has done it through unrestricted operating grants. So the not-for-profit sector has been asking for that for decades. And, we're now calling this trust philanthropy and looking at sort of what does that mean, right? And it means sort of trusting those community organizations. And so I think in order for us we need, as a philanthropic community, we need to continue to try to share what we've learned about this with our government partners, so that government can see some different ways of supporting the sector going forward. I think that we need sector-specific supports from government. So we saw recently an announcement of, I think it was $350 million for the arts, sport and recreation part of our sector, which is really, really important. I think that we will see organizations, most of the charitable sector and the nonprofits are very small organizations, many without any staff at all. And so those will be the organizations most likely to disappear in the short run. I think that one of the biggest challenges ahead is trying to understand how the amazing volunteer force in Canada is reactivated, right? Because all of these organizations rely heavily on the generous volunteers in our communities to make them work. And so how does that get reactivated? And will be key to the survival of many organizations, is finding safe ways for people to be able to, once again, to volunteer for the organizations and the causes that they're passionate about.
I was surprised to see so many not-for-profit organizations come together during this crisis and actually work together. Is that common?
Well, there's a lot of collaboration and cooperation that goes on amongst community organizations. But it's also true that, the way that we have, primarily around funding, the way both government and very often foundation funding as well, is really
competitive.
Well, it's competitive, but it's also, this is what I'm trying to flip on its head by talking about community-led solutions. Because what happens is a foundation or a government department has a strategy and says, here's what we think needs to happen to fix whatever it is we're going to fix, or to support whatever it is we're going to support. And you have to then fit yourselves as an organization, fit yourselves into this box. And so for every nonprofit organization out there, every charity out there, the jigsaw puzzle of revenue sources is remarkable, and all the different threads and that they have to stay on top of, right? So they're so very often their focus then is so focused on how do we keep all of what we're doing going, and how do we make sure that our social enterprise piece is working and that revenue's flowing, and our ticket sales if we're a performing arts organization. And so the opportunities to actually collaborate are not as there's not as much time for that, and there's not as much, good collaboration requires time, right? It requires strong relationships, and it requires time. And most organizations, have a huge mandate, are under-resourced, because even when we do fund, for the most part, that funding is not really sufficient, and the needs are growing. Imagine Canada appointed a chief economist some years ago, and they've been doing a lot of work around trying to understand what they call the social gap. So understanding the changing demographics in our country and the rising needs for various kinds of community organizations and social supports, and what has been a shrinking donor base in Canada, and looking at that gap. And it's in the billions, and it's not going anywhere. And so I think if out of this comes lessons of collaboration to show various levels of funders and government that there are opportunities here, when given the opportunity, or when necessity is that mother of invention, groups come together to collaborate to support their communities, and it works. So how can we listen more and do more to support that?
I know that earlier you talked about some of the adversity of the crisis, and hopefully we're seeing some of the best. We
certainly have. I have, whether it's, at the foundations coming together in ways that have not happened before. I've seen, I see a lot of trust building going on amongst different kinds of organizations, which I think has been really, really great. Not without, relationship building takes time and is challenging, and as is collaboration. But, certainly in the downtown east side, the community organizations from the front line to the large faith-based groups came together to help their community when there was no other help forthcoming, and acted quickly, and acted from a place of not from a place of what does my organization need, but what do the people who are in our community who are not able to access us in the same way as organizations, or the government supports, all of which take time to roll out. What happens in the meantime? And so they came together, right? And we saw food programs being coordinated. We saw community safety being a huge issue, and we saw people understanding that there was a whole lot of people who were displaced from their limited work and income opportunities and not eligible for many of the government supports. So peer work, redeploying workers across social enterprises to ensure that people could continue to work and survive. And then really focused on understanding that it was fine that we moved to to-go food, but for many people in the inner city, there's nowhere to go to. And for women, that of course created some very dangerous situations and led to some real tragedy in our community. And so, women's organizations came together to open Sister Square and other respite places so that women had some safe space and community. So I've seen a whole number of, really amazing responses. The dollars to support that for the most part are coming from the philanthropic sector, with some support, for some limited support from the city's limited budget to be able to do these things. So there's been some really, positive things to see and positive lessons to take from that. And I'm hoping that we see some of that continue.
So if people want to help, what do you want to see change?
Well, I think some of it is to continue what people have been doing, which is to support, to support the organizations that, they have been associated with, right? And not to, and to try to work with those organizations to be creative of how to support them. One of the challenges that the current big challenge is our community is supported by in-kind donations in a really huge way from households. And right now, that's not possible in COVID-19 because we just don't have the capacity to safely receive and distribute those donations. So thinking about, trying to think about ways to what would be needed to make that possible. And so working with community organizations that people already support to find out to ask what they need that might be different from what they've needed in the past. Also, I think to for people to continue to give charitably, to give to the organizations that they support, to give to organizations like mine that will then use those funds to invest them in community-led solutions.